All right, folks, I'm back once again. Trying a new position here. I'm like in the corner of the kitchen. The computer is on the counter. My wife is in the bedroom over there, so there's kind of a wall separating us. She's in a meeting right now. I'm talking into a wall, so hopefully I don't disturb her. She's talking to the deans right now about the fiscal situation of the university and what this might mean in terms of budget cuts and all sorts of really important stuff. And of course, I'm talking to you about something important too, which is this class. Um, and you could see, actually, you can't see, it's sad. It just looks really bright behind me, but through those windows, there's just giant hills and a valley, and it's really gorgeous. So it's a nice place for me to be, and the light seems good. Of course, the QuickTime froze up yesterday. It'll probably do the same again today, but we'll see. Um, I am going to do tomorrow the live video chat. I've already set up the chat room. Just go Blackboard, left hand side. There'll be a live video chat content link there, and you just check into that 15 minutes before 2 p.m. You'll be able to join the board. And I'd like to see some more of you there. If we only have 3 or 4, that's fine, but I'd like to have more. Um, I apologize once again for just not remembering to do it yesterday. Especially excited because now at home we've just improved our internet connection, and I'll be back in San Antonio tomorrow, not here at the ranch. I just looked over the folks who've already replied. One thing first, I also asked you, to try a little bit harder to look at the video lectures. I learned that there were a few people who didn't even know that I was putting up video lectures. And it was one student, especially from our other class, who's awesome, who's there for the video chats, writes great responses, is super serious. When we met in person, he was there every day, and he's like, I totally missed the fact that you made video lectures that went along with the PowerPoints. And I'm like, geez, if you missed it, a lot of people probably missed it. Even though I've referenced them before, even though some of you have been giving me feedback, you find those video lectures. Once again, you go to the left-hand side of the Blackboard page. There's the content. That's where you see the PowerPoints and everything else. And then there will be a folder that says video lectures. And by date, you get a YouTube link to all the lectures. And I have a feeling that most of you know they were there because initially a lot of people were watching, and then after the fact, not so many people. But at the end of the day, at the end of this semester, I'll get some more feedback on that and figure out a way in which to maybe improve them. I have heard from some people who saw my email on the matter that it's just not this class. Viewership of those video lectures in other classes has gone way down. Students are having a tough time. They're kind of losing touch a little bit. Also, the credit, no credit option, a lot of students are going to take that, so they feel they can maybe call it in a little bit more and not pay as much attention, which is understandable. But I do put a lot of work into those, as I'm doing with this one today. So if a few more of you watch them, even just for a minute, that way I'll just see that somebody, clicked on it. That would make me a little bit happier. So today we're gonna, I asked you to skim 4 chapters. They are long chapters. They are complicated chapters. Oh yes, I'm supposed to talk about the discussion board from Tuesday. Today's Wednesday. Really interesting material. I saw some surprising responses there. One of the other reasons to watch the video lectures is because this is where I reply to the discussion boards. A lot of you, are hardcore cultural anthropologists, don't feel you can judge other people's actions. Some of you said, man, I just can't get behind this. I can look at it. I can try to understand it. The point of methodological relativism is not to say that everything's okay and there's no such thing as bad or evil or, absolute good in the world. It's to try to understand it from the perspectives of people so that you can maybe come to a more informed moral judgment of it. So when we read about, the Waorani killings, even the Tarumanani killings, we learned that it's not about increasing the renown or the power of the killer. It's about their overwhelmingly historically informed sensibility that everybody they meet who is not them is out to kill them. And if they don't kill them, they themselves will be killed. I think a lot of us understand the rationale behind defensive violence. Whether we think that's true, that they will be killed, I mean, they have been. A lot of people have gone in and tried to commit genocide against the Waharani. A lot of Waorani groups kill each other. They look at all killings as extremely sad, unfortunate events. That is very different from the Wari. The Wari, if we believe Vilasa's ethnography, and maybe some of us will question it because she doesn't really get into the motivations of individuals. The Wari are really positive about killing. They see themselves as predators. In fact, the people they kill, they portray them as without fault, as peaceful. And in order, the reason they kill them is to increase their own power and strength and vitality originally for the killers, and then possibly some of that power goes on to women and non-killers, either via the transmission of semen or via eating the corpse of the dead enemy. It's also important to realize here that a lot of the people the Wari are killing, the only people the Wari are killing are not Wari. There are other indigenous peoples who maybe don't want to be involved in these cycles of predation, or they're, Brazilian settlers, and you might say, well, that's good. These are people who are overrunning and conquering their territory. They don't deserve to be there. This is Wari land, so maybe they should be killed. But, they kill kids and stuff like that, isolated settlers. And I think it's all right for you to say, man, I just can't get behind this. I don't support it. It's a self-centered form of killing. It's not quite as simple. As I mentioned in the last lecture, they're out not to, commit genocide against their enemies. They're out to kill a single person. They want their enemies to continue to exist so their own society can continue to exist. Now put that against Brazilians, quote unquote whites, who go into a Wari village and slaughter everybody in a very vicious way. You might say one of those is worse than the others, and I think morally you'd be on pretty good ground saying that. But even if you don't want to go to that extreme and think about vengeance, I actually feel like vengeance might be a stronger motivation than Vilasa tells us, because she has a point she's trying to make about the Wari being predators. And that doesn't only make sense relative to the logic of their own culture, she's trying to make them fit into this pan-Amazonian, pan-Indigenous American scheme, this idea of generalized predation, that to be a human is to be a predator. And that is an idea that does not fit my own Kofan ethnography, nor does it fit the Waorani case. These are people who see themselves as prey, not as predators. To be a human is not to be a predator for the Kofan or the Waorani. So I think Vilasa might have some blinders on, trying to support the generalizing representations of her advisor, Viveros de Castro, and the famous anthropologist from whom he took inspiration, Claude Lévi-Strauss. We'll talk about these two when we go over myth. So anyways, really interesting thought there. The material will continue to come up because not all of you have commented yet. I also still am getting some comments. People say, hey, I tried to, respond to the Thursday prompt on Monday or Tuesday. You got to do that by Sunday. That's what the syllabus says. So go back and read the syllabus to make sure on timing. I'm not going to change the structure again because I've already changed it too many times. So for Thursday, you have until noon on Sunday. And for Tuesday classes, you have until noon on Thursday. So today, these 4 chapters, I'm not sure how closely you read them. It's so much material, we don't have time, so I ask you to skim them. But I imagine some of you are more interested. I've learned a lot of folks in this class are very interested in different aspects of this book. So they're really putting a lot of work into things that I'm not focusing on. I know one of our students, I just spent a long time talking to her yesterday, is very interested in linguistics and phonetics of the Wari language. Hopefully she's going to put a video together that we can all watch about the correct way to pronounce all these Wari words that I'm mispronouncing myself because I don't know the language. Other people are interested in the music of Wari people. Other students are very interested in a feminist take on this material. So they're really reading it and putting a lot of conceptual work into doing that, and that's great to see. And I'd like to see some more of that come up on the discussion boards. But for me as a professor, to see how deeply some of you are engaging, even if it's like hypercritical, that's what this is about. And that makes me feel better about teaching these texts. Even if you react negatively to them, you're learning a lot by building a critical sensibility about them. So it's really good to see. So today, chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7 of Strange Enemies. I've entitled the lecture Myth, Enemies, Affines, the Dead, and Whites as Strange Enemies. We get introduced to the title and the idea behind the title in this book in chapter 7, and we'll spend a lot more time talking about it when we go over the conclusion in detail. But here it's introduced. So for your discussion board prompt for today, Thursday, it's a simple one. I just want to know what y'all think about Vilasa's use of myth and mythical analysis in her larger argument about Wari culture, and the place of the enemy in Wari culture and whites as enemies. Do you find her use and analysis of myth compelling? Do you find it not compelling, unpersuasive? Is it boring to you? Is it complicated? Is it impossible to understand? Just tell me what you think about it. There are many different ways to analyze myth. Vilasa is a more or less orthodox structuralist, and I can talk more about what a structuralist analysis of myth is, but these 4 chapters are a good example of what you would do as a structuralist analyzing myths and what kind of material you hope to get from them. So write about what you think about these chapters, even if you can only glance at them. So the first chapter, chapter 4, it's about a myth, the myth of a guy named Oropichi. I'm not sure that pronunciation is correctly. So this myth involves a boy. I'm just going to go over this stuff very quickly. There's a lot of text on these slides. Sometimes I'll just read it. Sometimes I'll just mention it, and you can go read it yourself when I post the PowerPoints. So this first myth she goes into involves a boy. His name was Oropichi, who slept with his older brother's wife. He left the village and he took water with him. Remember, water is very important in Wari culture, according to Vilasa. People go underwater when they die. And then he returned to his people with water. Then he went back to where he was before with many other people that he took with him. And he gradually became a white person. And all the people who went with him became white people too. They acquired clothes. And once again, remember, white hair means Brazilian, means non-indigenous person, not just, Euro-American in a broad sense. So these people who went with Oropichi, they acquired clothes, they acquired firearms, they broke off all their ritual festival exchanges. Remember those 3 festivals we talked? They stopped doing that with other Wari people. And then, the Wari said, well, these people are now our enemies. They are whites. So here in this myth, we get the explanation of where whites as enemies came from in terms of Wari mythology. So this myth shows that the whites are Wari who moved to an area actually avoided by the Wari, a large river. Remember, they live upland along small streams, large rivers associated with enemies, associated with death, associated with the destruction of Wari culture. So already here we see, the differentiation of this group who went with Oropichi. And it also, this myth shows that whites changed this festival exchange by substituting the exchange of parties, inviting groups of people, giving them various kinds of fermented or unfermented maize drinks. Instead of exchanging festivals and drinks, they began to exchange arrows with them and then gunfire. So you have, the kind of theme of violence and affinity that's in these festivals is really replaced by vicious physical violence, and enemies as killing enemies, truly killing enemies, not symbolically kind of killing enemies. So according to the myth and Vilasa's interpretation, the whites were initially Wari who pursued a process of what she calls enemization. They came from the Wari, but then they became enemies. So they moved away entirely, socially, spatially, and just instead of any kind of social interaction, it was just a purely violent interaction with itself. Vilasa tells us a kind of social interaction, but one based on radical difference, right? No peaceful interactions at all. Also in this chapter, Vilasa explores the idea of what she calls the emergence of difference from an initial unity, right? Originally we had these 2 brothers in the Oropichi myth, and Oropichi moves away and becomes somebody else. So this idea of the emergence of difference from initial unity is something that, according to Levi-Strauss, who wrote, 4 or 5 giant books on the mythology of all indigenous Native Americans peoples from North and South America, this is a theme you see within Native American mythology. That's his interpretation. So most of that comes from one of these books called The Story of Lynx. It's not one of the main books of the mythology, kind of a side commentary, but this is one of the most important books in interpreting Amazonian mythology. A lot of people like Vilaça, Viveiros de Castro, my dissertation advisor, Manuela Carneiro da Cunha. I worked under a Brazilian Orthodox structuralist myself. She was one of my advisors. Terry Turner was the other. So they argue that, there's this kind of dualist organization in indigenous American thought, mainly is manifested in their myths. There are all these myths about twins and what happens to twins, and how out of this initial unity of identical, siblings usually, you have this kind of doubling of difference. Difference kind of emerges out of it. And Vilaça says all these myths you see all over the Americas are quote unquote similar to the Oropishi myth. So she really wants to get to the germ of these myths, kind of abstractly find the main idea, and then say how that's replicated in the myths of other groups, such that out of the entirety of the Americas and the indigenous societies there, you get this really interesting philosophy of the emergence of disunity out of unity. Can't get it just from looking at the Wari myths. You have to find resonance in other myths across, the hemisphere, sometimes in an inverted form, sometimes in a parallel form, but all of these myths, or many of them, according to Vilaça, reinforce this basic idea. And she does a lot of that cross-cultural work here, the kind of work we saw Viveiros de Castro do in his article on Amerindian perspectivism, right? He wasn't just writing about one group of people, the people he did field work with, the Atawete. He was writing about all Amazonian people. I have questioned that idea too, because I don't believe the Kofan people have perspectivism as their main cosmology or ontology, their theory of reality. I argue with these people. They say they're Amazonian people. Of course they have it. And I'm like, I'm a pretty careful ethnographer. I've done 5 years of embedded research in Kofan communities. I speak the language. I've collected the myths. I study shamanism. Don't see much perspectivism there. And I'm not sure this idea about the emergence of disunity out of unity in mythology, I don't think it's there either. So anyways, I'm critical, partially because my ethnography, I can't fit it into these slots as easily as someone like Vilaça might. But, how she analyzes myths, there's many other things in these huge myths that she could pay attention to. So she's looking for the central idea and hence leaving out a lot of other stuff. And just think about somebody like Levi-Strauss. He was analyzing hundreds, thousands of myths. He didn't speak the languages of the people. He didn't do ethnography of them. He has, French or English translations of these myths, and you miss out so much. How myths are actually told, the individual who's telling them, what's the context, what's the grammatical structure of the language, what's the narrative structure of the myths over time. That's the kind of material that's really interesting. I think it's important to understand myth along those lines. It's not essential to structuralist analysis of myths. So page 145, a long quote. And in these quotes, I've bolded and put in italics what I think are central ideas that I want to comment on. They're not in the original text. So quote, the Wari conceive of matrimony as an exchange of women. I already know from the discussion, Jenny, of course, is very critical of the very patriarchal nature of Wari society and upset that Vilaça doesn't pay more attention to it because it's clearly there. So hopefully Jenny will chime in on the video chat tomorrow and talk more about this. The Wari conceive of matrimony as an exchange of women. Normally it's the woman's family, her parents and brothers, who offer her to the husband. However, when a man is close to death, he may act like a consanguine of his wife by offering her to his brother. Indeed, the Wari often say that spouses eventually possess a single body, implying the idea of consubstantiality. We've talked about that before. The same act is made by Oropishi's brother on meeting him at the large river, and the brother of Huijin, the hero of another myth, which we'll talk about in the next chapter, when already dead, as we shall see later. This implies that brothers are consanguines in whom one can locate a germ of affinity. And for the Wari, affinity means alterity, a relation of latent hostility and tension. The typical affine is a foreigner, a member of another subgroup. It's into a foreigner that Oropishi turns himself before becoming white during that process of venomization. Analyzing the different versions of the myth and the ethnographic evidence, the foreigner clearly emerges as the locus of movement, someone who can be incorporated as a co-inhabitant or turned into an enemy. Nothing there is that surprising. This whole book is about the relationship to alterity, the instability of the other in Wari life. Somebody marries in, they're a foreigner, you make them as a consanguine, but there's always this kind of tension, possible violence that turns into, let's say, a club fight. And the most other being the enemy with whom, you don't intermarry at all, and you actually war. But what I want to call attention to in this quote is that one passage in italics. This implies that brothers are consanguines in whom one can locate a germ of affinity. Where does she get that idea, that interpretation? It's the idea that when a man is dying, his wife is already like his consanguine because they've been exchanging substances, and he will give to his brother. This is a practice you see in the in the Bible. I think they call it the levirate. His wife. So you have the brother who's equivalent, to the wife, and his own brother in some way, acting as a wife giver, which makes him more like an affine. So she looks at it and say, so within marriage and siblingship, where you're supposed to have consanguines, there's this idea of possibly giving a woman to somebody else, a wife to somebody else, and that's like affinity. Could you interpret it that way? Sure. Is there something else you could focus on equally in this book? And, maybe say, well, that's not like affinity at all. It's more like, incest. It's marriage amongst people who are already consanguineal related. You could come up with that interpretation too. She's looking for evidence in these myths that supports her general idea about the role of alterity and otherness in Wari society. So I just want to say that's one interpretation that she makes. It's not the only possible interpretation. You kind of have to go along with the ride, see how interesting these arguments are. And as I said before, it may be fascinating, but I don't know if it's necessarily true. If the interpretations are Vilasa's, or if they're Wari's, or if another anthropologist could come up with a completely opposite interpretation that's just as compelling. That's my main problem with this kind of mythical analysis. So chapter 5, another myth, this of Huijin, another italics passage at the beginning of the first quote I'm going to read from page 146. The idea of a pair of brothers as the starting point for the separation between co-inhabitants and foreigners, the basis of a process of animization, becomes more clearly evident in the Huijin myth. So once again, I'm not going to read the rest of that passage. She looks at another myth, which is very different in many ways from the Oropishi myth. This is the myth of Huijin, as just a confirmation of her interpretation of one central point of the Oropishi myth, the first one. This is what structuralists do. They look at myths, they compare them, they break them down into these very small constituent units that look like basic clauses or sentences. We'll see that on the next slide. And then they try to find other myths that reinforce the basic sense of that interpretation, or sometimes invert it, which itself is a reinforcement. An inversion maintains the central relation, it just turns it upside down. So why does she go to the second myth? Because it tells her, and it tells the reader, if you follow Vilasa, that this idea really makes sense because it's in more than one myth. It's in two myths, at least, and we'll see now it's in another two later on, according to her interpretation. Vilasa argues that comparing the Oropishi and Huijin myths allows for an hypothesis concerning the equivalence between whites and the dead. She does a lot of symbolic analysis of the myths, searching for solutions to various problems posed by how the myths match or conflict with each other, as well as Levi-Strauss's observations about the dualist nature of indigenous American thought. So let's go to the next slide. We have these two myths broken up as a structuralist into what Vilasa or Levi-Strauss, if you were to would call the basic mythemes. It's kind of a, that idea comes from linguistics, the phonemes, the basic, sound elements of a language. Well, they call these the basic conceptual elements of a myth, a mytheme, and they just look like little sentences. Once again, you could find different ones. This is how they break it up. And these two myths of Oropishi and Huijin are almost exactly the same, but she wants to make another point. Not only does the Huijin myth, represent or reinforce her interpretation of the Oropishi myth, it makes an additional linkage between the dead and the brother-in-law. So these are basically all the same until you look at the last line. In the Oropishi myth, Oropishi returns definitively to the shore of the great river. He becomes white, and Huijin, killed by the wife who makes him eat his children, returns definitively to the underworld, becoming dead. So here you see an equivalence, according to this analysis, between white people and the dead. And the dead themselves, as we learn later, are a form of other, um, and kind of like a festival like exchange. There's a process of alterity there. So you have the affines, you have whites, you have the dead. These are all part of the same conceptual class for Vilasa in Wari culture when you look at these myths the way she does. Oh, this myth. I have no idea how to pronounce this. I always, misspell this name because it's got 5 syllables and they're all the same. The na myth. Na myth. I don't even know if that was, I'm not trying to make fun of it. It's an impossible word for me. So this is the third myth she looks at. And she says it's about the reconstruction of society after its destruction by water. Remember, water is what people in a festival, when they feed the guests huge amounts of beer and get them drunk, symbolically kill them, they pour warm water on them to revive them. The water is also where people go after they die. So it's a really important element in Wari culture. Once again, Vilasa argues that there are structural affinities between the na myth and the Oropishi myth. Once again, another myth reinforces her central interpretation of the first myth. And that she also says that one can only understand a myth by comparatively analyzing it alongside others, not only those from the same ethnic group, but those from other peoples. So for her, you're not going to take a myth and say, oh, I need to analyze it and figure out what it means and I can get a definitive interpretation of it. You need to, understand it as a transformation or a variant on a whole bunch of myths, not only from within Wadi society, but from within myths of other Amazonian peoples, lowland South American peoples. She talks about myths from the Cree, from Native North Americans living way up in Canada, as confirming her basic interpretation of this myth. This is this idea that all Indigenous Americans are conceptually, philosophically, basically the same. I've always argued that the diversity of culture is much greater than this, and this kind of interpretation flattens the really strong conceptual differences held by these people. Just think about the Wari and the Waorani. One understands themselves as prey, one understands themselves as predators. It seems extremely different to me, but Vilasa and others like her, in my mind, kind of paper over these differences. So some quotes from this chapter. Other details from these two myths that seem incomprehensible start to make sense when read in conjunction. Just an idea there that you can't look at a single analysis of a single myth and analyze it. You have to read other ones to see, oh, something doesn't make sense. I don't interpret it the way I think I should be able to. Well, if I read it as a transformation of this other myth, then I can see something in it that reinforces my central idea. Page 173, a small detail present in the finale to some versions of na begins to make sense when it emerges inverted in Oropishi, right? There's things in this myth, she doesn't know how to interpret them. But then when you look at this myth in relationship to the first one she analyzed, the same elements there, but it's just inverted. So once again, these myths do, for her, convey this central idea about, the whites and dead and affines and enemies and all of this kind of stuff. Page 164. And the story of Links Levi-Strauss shows that the creation of whites typically coincides with the creation of Indians, a consequence of the dualist organization of Amerindian thought, which leads to a successive doubling of terms. I never use the word Amerindian in my work because it just means that all indigenous peoples of the Americas are the same. I never talk about Indian thought, indigenous American thought, Amerindian thought. Because like I said, I think there's a lot of diversity. I think these peoples would be the first to say there's a lot of diversity between them, and to say they all have the same kind of basic meanings in their cultures, I think is both empirically wrong and a little ethically problematic. But if, Vilasa's not, she's a brilliant scholar, as is Viveros de Castro, as was Levi-Strauss, who lived to be 100 and then died. They know the ethnographies, they've read them all, and they see similarities and patterns there. Whereas someone like me, I just write about Kofan people and turn to other, ethnography of other peoples for ideas, for hunches, especially if they're neighboring each other. But I don't just use the Kofan to support these broad cosmological or ontological themes or ideas that supposedly are shared by all Indigenous Americans. Here you see the na-na-na-na myth, and basically broken up into myth themes. You know, you just see that they're exactly the same. According to Vilasa, you see the same ideas almost, myth theme by myth theme in the two. Just once again reinforces her basic interpretation of the first myth and all the myths she looks at. Last myth she talks about in chapter 7, the myth of Pinam. I don't really discuss this one in detail. I've already discussed 3 of them. There's a lot here. So she analyzes this myth of Pinam alongside the other Wari myths she's already explored, as well as the cross-cultural material she's drawn from mythical analysis from Veros de Castro and Levi-Strauss from across the Indigenous Americas. Her conclusion, page 175, we began our analysis of Wari mythology with a myth in which a wife-taking man took away all the water from the Wari. We now finish with the myth, apparently the inverse of Oropishi, the story of a wife-taking man who took away fire from the Wari. This myth, referred to here as Pinam, is the Wari origin myth of fire and funerary cannibalism, and in some versions, a myth too about the origin of death. So once again, it's a central play on these concerns. Even though it's in inverted form, it's about where death comes from, why it's associated with water, why it's associated with enemies, and why, in some ways, whites have been, put by the Wari into this space, into this position that she says is central to Wari culture. Last slide, and this gets us to kind of the title of the book and something we'll talk about, not with any more mythical analysis, but just in terms of the more conceptual conclusion of this book, which I think we'll get to next week, Thursday, last class, right? Page 193. Our analysis of this set of Wari myths has shown that the whites are conceived as enemies, and that the enemy is related to the dead and the brother-in-law as well as the foreigner, right? All these positions are kind of the same. They're all about difference for Vilasa. But how can whites be brothers-in-law if the Wari do not marry whites? And this is something she says is still true. I wonder if it's really true in 2020. She says it's true, they don't marry whites, but they live alongside them. Precisely for this reason, we could say, as I've already shown, brothers-in-law and affines in general are those with whom one avoids exchanging women, because there's enemy, there's tensions, there's violence, but with whom one is forced to live in a relatively peaceful coexistence, as is visible in the relation with a foreigner, right? Difference is essential, but it's always tense. You're supposed to marry a person who is different, but that could easily lead to re-animization if you break off these cycles of festivals and exchange, and there's no peaceful contact, no exchange of goods or women, or the affine, the brother-in-law, whatever, needs to be made into a consanguine to become part of you, and that difference kind of needs to be erased within a village. Otherwise, that tension can rip things apart. Page 193 to 194. Before pacification, the Wari never lived with enemies, right? Only with other Wari people, whether Indians or whites. Enemies were to be killed and eaten without any exchange of words or goods, much less women. The white enemies arrived, and the Wari began, partly out of choice, partly through coercion, to live with them on a daily basis, exchanging words and objects, though not women, as they did with Indians from other ethnic groups, who became co-inhabitants and ended up being incorporated as Wari. As we've seen, real affinity is a primary means of incorporation, since marriage involves intimate coexistence, and with it the exchange of bodily substances and commensality, just like I said about the Wairani, and results in the consubstantiality of those living in spatial proximity. As a result, they come to be treated as consanguines rather than affines. Whites, aside from no longer being able to be killed and eaten, are also co-inhabitants with whom one should live in peace. So are they not brothers-in-law or enemies, whom one can no longer engage in war, and with whom one is forced to live in peace? I return to this question in the conclusion. This is where the title of the book comes from. Whites definitively are enemies, but they're enemies you live with. The Wari have to live with now. They can't fight them, they can't kill them, they can't isolate themselves from them. But they're also not making them into Wari by marrying them and sharing substances. So they're maintaining their enmity but also living with them at the same time. So they're a new kind of enemy, a strange kind of enemy. And at the very end, actually, Vilasa interprets this in terms of shamanism. Shamans, for the Wari and for many peoples, indigenous peoples, Amazonian peoples, shamans can have multiple bodies and multiple points of view at the same time. So she actually argues in the conclusion that the majority of Wari people are living as shamans now. They want to be Wari and have that body and viewpoint, but by living with the whites and adopting elements of white culture, wearing white clothes, eating white food, they want to be white at the same time. So, like shamans, they have multiple perspectives, multiple bodies, multiple viewpoints simultaneously. They don't want to give up being Wari, but they want to be white too at the same time. What a strange idea. It doesn't match our notion of assimilation or something like that. For Vilasa, this is a properly Amazonian form of integration, let's say, with others, with national society, with settlers, with all of that stuff. Very interesting. Do I buy it? Do I really believe that Wari people aren't marrying Brazilians now? I don't think so. But maybe. It's what she tells us. She's the expert. But, she wrote this a long time ago, and maybe things have changed. One final comment. You've heard me questioning all of this kind of mythical analysis. I pay attention to myth. I've used it in some of my articles. And sometimes these classical oppositions that you see in a myth, explained in a myth, you do see them in other elements of indigenous culture and Kofan culture. I'll give you an example. I already went into fieldwork thinking, I don't really buy this kind of structuralist analysis. One day we were really hungry. A guy I was living with, I heard him take a shot late at night. And I'm like, oh, finally we're going to get meat to eat. And he shot a possum. And, I know people in the United States eat possums, but he took this big, beautiful, fatty possum and he threw it into the river. And I was like, why the hell did you do that? We're hungry. We've been living off plantains and bananas for 3 days. And he said, ayete. It's a dead person. It's a ghost. And I'm like, what do you mean the possum's a dead person, a ghost? And he's like, konda sechitsahin. There's a myth or a story about that. And he went into this myth. And he said, there's a story. A Kofan guy a long time ago was going fishing at night. Already strange, right? Going fishing with a net at night. Not something one usually does. He's going fishing on a rocky river, upriver Kofan territory. And all of a sudden, an Aya, a bone demon, a ghost, a dead person, confronts him. And, he's scared of this thing. This thing tries to attack him. So he fights with it. Takes his right hand. Boom. Hits the Aya. Doesn't do anything. Right hand. Boom. Hits him again. Doesn't do anything. Takes the right hand. Boom. Doesn't do anything. Finally takes his left hand. Boom. The Aya flies into the river. Sinks. Goes underwater, right? Water here. Raises above the water. Another kind of classic rising and falling, water, land, night and day, all these classical, structural oppositions, binary oppositions here. Arises as a butterfly, sinks back underwater, jumps back out as an Aya, as a bone demon again. So the guy fights it again. Right hand, boom, right hand, boom, right hand, boom, nothing. Hits it again with a left hand, knocks it down, covers it with a stone, right? Stone, water, same kind of things you're seeing here. It's not like you can ignore these conceptual differences and ideas here. Goes back the next day with people from the village, and he's like, I just killed the bone demon, an Aya, and I put it under a stone, so it's still there. Let's go take a look at it. Lifts up the stone, and it's a possum. What do you do with that? You can't deny it. And what if the clear opposition here that I see, and obviously, water, night, day, stone, these are all important ideas, rising and falling, but the left versus the right is a classical opposition. You talk to shamans, even the word for the left hand, pavefa, pa, that's also the word for to die. So there's like a linguistic connection between the left and death. When someone is training to be a shaman, they will say they will only eat the left side of animals they kill because those belong to kukuya, to the dead, to the demons, to the Aya. And that's what they need to familiarize themselves with in order to progress on their path, to start acquiring violent powers. So there are things there. There's ways in which myths reverberate with other elements of culture that, if I'm talking about Kofan shamanism and this association of the left with death, with supernatural beings, with malevolent beings, of course I'm going to talk about this myth. And of course, it's going to help me to understand these taboos that go along with shamanic learning. So I don't want to totally poo poo it. But do I need to read myths from 1,000 different other Indigenous American peoples to help me understand that? I don't think so. I'll go and read them and they might give me some hunches, but I'm not going to use my ethnographic material to show that the Kofan are the same as all other Amazonian peoples. I want to use it just to understand the kinds of coherence and meaning within Kofan culture itself. And myth will help me to get there. So anyways, there's an example, and I'm going to cut that off for now. Hopefully the breaks weren't too bad, and we'll see you soon.